Welcome to the deep dive. We cut through the noise, take those really complex topics and just pull out the key stuff you need to know fast.
Yeah, make you smarter, quicker.
Exactly. And today we're doing one of our talk tensor sessions. We're going to unpack a really interesting machine learning paper that you flagged. Think of it like getting the inside scoop directly from the researchers.
Right. This one's called The Spectral Bias of Shallow Neural Network Learning is Shaped by the Choice of Non-linearity. SAS et al. It's pretty dense, but it really tries to get at how neural networks actually learn internally.
Okay, cool. So our mission today, break down the paper, summarize it, talk about the history leading up to it, maybe some future stuff.
That's the plan. Give everyone a solid handle on what it's about and why it matters.
Spectral bias, okay. And nonlinearity, that's just the activation function, right? Like ReLU or sigmoid or whatever.
Yep, exactly. In these simpler, shallow networks they focus on.
So what is this spectral bias then, in simple terms? Why should we care?
Well, think about how we learn. Maybe you hear a song, you probably pick up the bassline, the overall rhythm first, right? The low frequency stuff.
Yeah, the main beat.
Right, before you start noticing all the little high notes, the intricate details. Spectral bias is kind of like that for neural networks learning functions. They tend to learn the broad, smooth, low frequency parts first.
Okay, so it's a learning preference, but why is that important?
Because it's key to understanding why these massive networks, these really over-parameterized ones, why they actually generalize. You'd think they'd just memorize the training data, but they don't.
Right, the overfitting problem that somehow isn't always a problem.
Exactly. And this paper argues that the specific activation function you choose really steers this bias, this preference for certain kinds of solutions. Understanding that could help us build, better models.
It is still pretty amazing they generalize so well. Feels like magic sometimes. So where does the paper kick off its investigation into this implicit bias?
So they start right there with that puzzle. How do over-parameterized networks avoid just memorizing? They talk about implicit bias or implicit regularization, some hidden preference guiding the learning.
Okay.
And to see it more clearly, they introduce this clever reparameterization, a different way to look at the network's parameters.
A new way to describe the network setup.
Yeah, specifically for shallow networks. It helps them get rid of this sort of mathematical redundancy. They call it a weight rescaling symmetry, or I degeneracy.
Okay, hold on. Redundancy, like different settings giving the same result. What's this I degeneracy thing?
Yeah, exactly. Think of one neuron. You've got its weights coming in, and maybe an overall scaling factor on its output, and a bias. Well, you could say double all the incoming weights, but then have the output scaling factor adjust the bias a bit. And the neuron calculates the exact same thing for any input.
Okay. So multiple combinations of numbers describe the same actual function, like different recipes for the same cake.
Perfect analogy. That's the I degeneracy. It kind of obscures what's really fundamental.
Gotcha. So how does their different parameterization, the Radon spline one, quite a name, how does that fix it? What are these I-key, I parameters?
Right, the ERS Radon spline, it's more geometric.
Yes.
I-key basically captures the orientation of the decision boundary that neuron creates. Think the angle of the line it draws.
Okay, the direction.
Then I-key is the signed distance of that line from the origin, how far off center it is.
Makes sense.
And I-key is basically the strength or scaling of that neuron's contribution to the final output.
Right.
They add one more, II, related to the original weight vector size, and together these give a unique description, a one-to-one map with the standard way, IN, no more redundancy.
Okay, clever. So they have this cleaner view. What do they find using it? You mentioned two main training regimes.
Yeah, they look at how training behaves under this lens, two key modes. The kernel regime, which is sometimes called lazy training, and the adaptive regime, or rich regime.
Lazy versus rich. Okay.
Right.
What's the difference?
In the kernel regime, those geometric parameters, the IC and I, the orientation and position of the boundaries, they pretty much stay put during training.
They don't move much.
Hardly at all. It's mainly the I's, the output strengths, that change. This happens when a value they call IC goes towards minus infinity. The network kind of acts like it's just learning weights for a fixed set of features.
Like using pre-made tools and just deciding how much to use each one. So what about the other way? When die goes to positive infinity, That's the adaptive or rich regime.
Exactly. In the adaptive regime, those decision boundaries defined by IC and I are actively moving around. They're changing during training.
So the network isn't just combining fixed features, it's actually learning what the features should be.
Precisely. It's adapting its internal representation.
Yeah.
Much more dynamic, much richer, you could say.
Okay, two really different learning styles. What were the big findings in the kernel regime first?
So in that lazy kernel regime, they found some neat stuff. They managed to generalize a known link between simple Railway-U networks and something called the Radon transform.
Wait, the Radon transform? Isn't that used in, like, CTAT scans? Medical imaging?
The very same. It's a mathematical tool for analyzing functions by looking at their integrals along lines or planes, like taking slices through something.
Weird. What's that got to do with neural nets?
Well, the connection is that shallow networks, especially with ReLU, can be sort of seen as building up functions by adding together these ramp-like things defined by hyperplanes. The Radon transform is the math that describes summing things up along lines or planes.
Huh. Okay, that's unexpected. So they generalize this connection.
Yeah, using the Radon spline parameterization, they showed this connection holds for a much wider class of activation functions, not just ReLU. And crucially, they derived an exact formula for the implicit bias in this kernel regime.
An actual equation for the network's preference.
Yes. And using the connection between the Radon transform and the Fourier transform, another powerful tool.
Which looks at frequencies, right?
Exactly. They can interpret this implicit bias as minimizing a specific spectral seminorm. Basically, the network prefers functions that are smooth in a particular way. It penalizes high-frequency components.
So it naturally avoids really jagged, complex functions.
In this regime, yes. And here's the kicker. The specific way it penalizes high frequencies depends directly on the choice of the activation function.
Whoa, so the activation isn't just switching things on or off, it's actively shaping the kind of solution the network prefers based on frequencies.
That's the big insight for the kernel regime. It means you could potentially design activation functions to encourage learning certain types of patterns, perhaps smoother ones for better generalization by controlling the spectral penalty.
That sounds like a really big deal, designing activations for specific spectral biases. What about the adaptive regime, the more dynamic one?
Right, the adaptive regime. Things are more complicated there because the boundaries are moving. What they found is evidence for local dynamical attractors.
Attractors, like stable points the network gets pulled towards.
Kind of like valleys in the learning landscape, yeah. The parameters tend to settle into these regions. And importantly, these attractors lead to the formation of clusters of hyperplanes.
Clusters, you mean the decision boundaries clump together?
Yeah, or at least align in similar directions. Many neurons end up having their zero planes, the points where their input is zero, very close together, or oriented similarly.
Why does that happen, and why is it important?
Well, it helps explain things people had observed before, like weights tending to concentrate in just a few main directions, even in very wide networks. It suggests a kind of representational compression is happening.
So even with tons of neurons, they might sort of team up and focus on similar features.
That seems to be the idea. They become somewhat redundant, focusing on similar aspects of the data. And again, they didn't just theorize this. They showed simulations where these clusters actually form during training.
Okay, simulations back it up. That gives a pretty good picture of the paper's main ideas. Let's pull back a bit. What was the research scene like before this? What questions were people grappling with?
The authors mapped this out nicely. Going back, people first tried to just understand what functions shallow ReLU networks could even represent. You know, the fundamental limits.
Like, what's the space of possibilities?
Exactly. This led to identifying that radon-seminorm connection pretty early on. Researchers like Savarees, Anji, and others developed these representer theorems, framing it as optimization in these abstract, infinite-dimensional function spaces, Banach spaces.
Sounds very theoretical.
It was, and that was a limitation. It was mathematically elegant, but it didn't directly say much about how gradient descent, the algorithm we actually use for training, finds solutions within that space.
Right. It described the map, but not the journey.
Yeah. Plus, it wasn't super intuitive. What does a function with a low radon-seminorm look like? And it mostly focused on ReLU, not other activations.
So what came next? Did people try to connect it more to training?
They did. Later work started looking specifically at the kernel regime, sometimes even with gradient descent, like showing that simple 1D ReLU nets minimize something related to the second derivative.
Okay, a measure of wiggliness.
Sort of, yeah. And that got generalized to higher dimensions, using the Radon transform again. But still, these results were often limited maybe to specific setups and didn't always give a clear intuition about generalization for practical networks.
And then there was this mean field approach mentioned. What was that about?
The mean field view. That took a different route. It looked at infinitely wide networks, letting the internal parts adapt. It led to these complex partial differential equations describing how the learned function evolves.
Infinite networks. Sounds useful theoretically, but how practical?
Well, it helped prove things about convergence and approximation power. But again, translating that back to understanding implicit regularization and generalization in the finite networks we actually use was tricky. The interpretability wasn't always there.
So it seems like there was this gap. We had bits and pieces, the possible function space, the lazy regime, the infinite limit, but not really a unified, intuitive way to understand how the activation function choice influences the bias in real training scenarios.
Exactly that. And that's what this paper tries to bridge, using their Radon spline parameterization as the key tool to connect activation choice, spectral properties, and learning dynamics in a more general way.
This is great context. Okay, let's get into the novel notions section. This sounds like where they explore the really forward-looking stuff, maybe extensions.
Yeah, this is where they start sketching out the implications. A key novel idea is really running with that Fourier interpretation of the Radon seminorm.
The frequency view.
Right. Since they link the Radon view to the Fourier view, they could talk about the bias purely in terms of frequency penalties.
Right.
And that led to this really cool idea. Maybe we can reverse engineer activation functions.
How so?
If you decide what kind of spectral penalty you want, like maybe you really want to kill high frequencies, you can use their equation 10 to figure out what activation function creates that specific penalty.
No way. So you could design an activation for a specific frequency response instead of just picking real U or ton.
That's the potential. They show examples in Table 1. Want a quadratic penalty on frequency? Try a step or log absolute activation. Want polynomial penalties? Look at the power real U family. It connects the math to actual function choices.
That is, wow. What could that mean for practical things like generalization or dealing with high-dimensional data, the whole curse of dimensionality?
Well, if you can precisely control the spectral bias, you might design networks that are much better suited to certain data types. Maybe you need smoothness for one task, maybe tolerance for some higher frequencies in another.
Tailoring the bias to the problem.
Exactly. They talk about penalizing contractions functions that get really spiky. A good bias should discourage that to avoid overfitting. They even suggest that the structure underlying shallow nets, tied to this Radon transform idea, might inherently help fight the curse of dimensionality by favoring these smoother functions.
Favoring smoothness helps ignore noise, basically. It makes sense. What else did they explore in this novel notions part?
They also look closer at the dynamics in the adaptive regime, using their Radon spline parameters, ARS. They found the loss function has this interesting piecewise quadratic shape when viewed through that lens.
Piecewise quadratic.
Okay. And talk about data point pinning, especially in 2D. It's like the decision boundary of a neuron gets sort of attached to or heavily influenced by a specific training data point.
Pinned, like stuck on a point.
Almost. Imagine the boundary moving during training. It might get really close to one specific point it's trying to classify correctly. Once it's close, the way it moves might change. It might mostly just pivot around that point. And if you have many boundaries and many points, you can get multiple boundaries pinned to different points, which could contribute to forming those clusters we talked about. They generalize this idea to higher dimensions too.
Interesting dynamic. And how does this pinning and clustering in their special parameter space translate back to the standard network parameters, the weights and biases we usually think about?
It's not a perfectly direct mapping. Because of that Jacobian factor they mentioned, it complicates the gradient flow a bit. But the qualitative behavior is linked.
So the general tendencies carry over.
Yeah, the important features of the loss landscape, like where the good solutions are, often correspond. So understanding pinning and clustering in the Radon spline view gives real insight into why standard network weights might concentrate or behave strangely. They even talk about a kind of shared velocity flow field guiding the boundaries.
Like an invisible current pushing them around?
Sort of. And it helps explain why the clusters aren't perfect, why they're often soft or smeared out. They also mention briefly that how smooth or discontinuous the activation function is likely affects these dynamics too.
Okay, so the theory is rich. Did the experiments back this all up? What did they test?
They ran several experiments. First, in the kernel regime, They checked if their theoretical prediction, equation 4, matched what happened when they actually trained networks using gradient descent.
And it did it.
Yep, pretty closely for various activations like ReLU, leaky ReLU, even quadratic ones. They also compared gradient descent to just directly solving the optimization problem using convex methods, showing they arrived at similar solutions.
Cool. What else?
Second, they used convex optimization to fit target functions that had specific known frequency components. This let them directly see how different activation functions emphasized or suppressed different frequencies in the learned function.
Did they see big differences?
They did, especially in how the energy was distributed across frequencies. Though interestingly, the total energy seemed somewhat similar across activations, hinting that maybe the orientation of the learned features is key for frequency selection.
Okay, and experiments on the adaptive regime.
Yeah. Third, they trained shallow nets on MNIST, the digit dataset, using different activations. This showed, well, that not all activations are created equal for practical tasks. Some trained fine, others had strong biases that really hurt generalization.
So the choice really matters in practice.
Definitely. And they measured clustering, finding that those zero-plane clusters seem to form pretty quickly during training, which supports their theory.
Any other experiments?
One last interesting one. They tried training adaptively for a while, then switching to the kernel regime, basically freezing the boundaries and only training output weights.
A hybrid approach.
Yeah, and the results suggested this might actually work sometimes. Performance didn't necessarily tank after the switch. Sometimes it even improves slightly. So maybe you can get the benefits of feature learning early on, then lock it down.
Fascinating. Okay, this paper clearly opens up a lot. What do the authors see as the next steps? Where does this research lead?
Well, they acknowledge their most precise results are for the kernel regime. So a big next step is extending that rigorous analysis to the adaptive regime. It's much harder, but really important.
Nailing down the math for the fully dynamic case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They also suggest looking for closed form expressions, actual formulas for kernel regime solutions. If you can just calculate the best fit directly sometimes, that would be way faster than training.
Wow. Yeah.
And kind of the holy grail here, combining the ability to design activations with specific spectral properties and maybe having closed form solutions could lead to highly interpretable, efficient, custom design networks.
Taking the guesswork out of architecture design.
That's the dream.
This has been super illuminating. So wrapping it up, the big takeaway seems to be this much clearer picture of how activation functions aren't just simple switches. They actively shape the kind of solutions neural networks find, especially regarding their frequency content, their spectral bias.
Absolutely. It moves us towards understanding implicit regularization, not just as some vague concept, but as something concrete tied to the activation function that we can potentially analyze and even control. It opens the door to more principled network design.
Yeah, you really start thinking, how could controlling spectral bias help in, image processing versus audio processing versus time series forecasting? They probably need different biases, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
Different tasks likely benefit from emphasizing different types of patterns, different frequency ranges.
Well, this has definitely given us, and hopefully our listeners, a lot to chew on. We've really only skimmed the surface here, so definitely check out the original paper by Saz and colleagues if you want the full mathematical rigor and all the experimental details.
For sure. And it really leaves you with that provocative thought. Are we heading towards a future where we routinely engineer activation functions, maybe specifying desired spectral penalties to build bespoke neural networks for specific tasks? Moving beyond trial and error towards a more deliberate science of deep learning architecture.
A fascinating possibility indeed. Thanks for unpacking that with us.
My pleasure. It's exciting stuff.